Speaking as somebody who adores Digimon and holds it very close to his heart, I gotta say, while I definitely enjoy and even love the games I've played, for one reason or another, they've always been one of the weaker parts of the franchise. Things did start taking a turn for the better though when Kazumasa Habu became Bandai's main producer for Digimon games back in 2010. Because while they still have their issues, the quality was generally a lot higher, with Digimon Story Cyber Sleuth and Hacker's Memory going on to become the best-selling games in the franchise, with a combined sales total of 1.5 million copies sold. During the development of the currently unnamed next Digimon story game, though, Habu would start work on Digimon Survive. After 4 separate delays thanks to things like COVID, as well as the change in development teams and game engines, it would finally release in 2022, with it quickly becoming my personal favorite game in the franchise. It wasn't free of issues, but what it did right more than made up for that in my opinion, and as a story, it's the best one Digimon's ever had. Honestly, while Cyber Sleuth is generally the better one to play for getting into the franchise, Survive easily has it beat if you enjoy games like this. So if I've caught your attention, join me while I sell you on why Digimon Survive is one of the franchise's greatest games. The story of Digimon Survive proper starts in our world, with our protagonist Takuma and friends on a historical extracurricular camping trip during spring break. See, they've gone to a mountain village to learn more about the town's local legends and history with the Kemonogami, beast gods that in ancient times the townspeople would offer child sacrifices to, but you would know them better as Digimon. The group, which consists of 6 students, 2 locals, and a visiting professor who studies the Kemonogami, would get a much more hands-on lesson with them than they anticipated after they somehow unknowingly wandered into their world. Aside from the professor, they all find a Digimon partner to call their own soon after coming to this world. And with their help, Takuma and co try to survive in this world they found themselves in, all while they try to figure out exactly how they get back home, which is easier said than done. The world they found themselves in is just as dangerous as it is mysterious, and Survive makes that very clear early on. The game's tone is much darker and more mature than anything else in the franchise, with the reasons why coming from a simple question Habu asked about how dangerous a situation like this would be for a group of kids and teenagers. I mean, for every good-hearted Digimon like Takuma's Agumon, who's just the most precious little dino nugget, there's just as many that are jerks, basically feral wild animals, or straight-up evil. Frankly, I don't think a lot of people will disagree with me when I say that Survive's darker tone is pretty realistic, all things considered. That tone can vary a bit in how dark it is though, based on your choices, because Digimon Survive, like many other visual novels, has multiple different story routes, with 1 being locked behind New Game Plus and 3 normal routes. These 3 story routes are Moral, Wrath, and Harmony. During the story, Takuma will be constantly faced with choices that will net him karma points in one of these areas. And while this mostly affects the gameplay, which we'll get more into later, it also affects the story. Kinda. See, without spoilers, these 3 story routes don't come into play until Chapter 8 of 12, where your total points will decide what branch you can go down. Until that point, the story stays pretty much the same. All of them are definitely great and really enjoyable alternate routes, but I wouldn't blame you for being a little bummed out that the story doesn't branch off earlier. For a hopefully inevitable sequel, I'd love for this karma system to only affect the gameplay and for the story to be decided more by your actual choices than a point system. Now, while the story and its many twists and turns are good, the real star of the show here is the main cast, because they are a big part of what makes this story so enjoyable and compelling. Let me tell you, the writing for these guys is very solid. Like, even the more dislikable characters are mostly really well written here, and the game really manages to capture how kids would be affected in a situation like this, for better or worse. A lot of the cast are very fun characters with plenty of great interactions, like with Saki and Minoru, who are 2 of my personal favorite characters in the game, with the latter having a moment during Chapter 2 that never fails at making me laugh. On that note though, let's finally get into character affinity. In Digimon Survive, most chapters have a point called Free Action, where you'll be given a set number of points to spend on talking with characters, and if you choose the right dialogue choices, you'll increase your affinity with them. But there are plenty of opportunities to do this outside of those sections as well, plenty of which are optional. Affinity almost entirely affects gameplay elements that aren't relevant at the moment, with one exception. And this leads us right to one of my favorite aspects of the story, with the relationship between the humans and their respective partner. Taking some inspiration from the original Digimon Adventure, each character's Digimon is what's referred to as their destined partner in-game, and they're meant to be a reflection of their human in some way, either by mirroring aspects of them or complementing them, and I love that they did this. It's a simple thing, but it adds some nice layers for each member of the cast's character. How many layers varies from person to person, but the main point is that it makes everyone even more interesting, or more interesting than what they would have been on their own. For example, we have Aoi, a 15-year-old girl who has a very mother-hen-like personality but also struggles with self-confidence, so to balance this out, her destined partner is Labramon, a dog-like Digimon that operates as Aoi's moral support to build up her confidence, and unfortunately lacks an official plushie, much to my inner cringy dog lover's dismay. Some of my favorite and the best examples actually come from two characters called Ryo and Shuji, but there's no possible way we can have any kind of meaningful discussion on them without spoilers, so we'll just have to get back to these two during the spoiler section. This relationship between the humans and their destined partner goes beyond just the writing though, because Digimon in this game don't unlock their evolutions by leveling up at all. Every character will get their Digimon's champion form during a moment in the story, with the exception of Kaito, but the ultimate and mega forms for everybody that isn't named Takuma will unlock theirs by doing a special battle in the Deepwood after getting 30 and 70 affinity respectively. As I just implied, Takuma works a bit differently. He and Agumon will unlock all of their evolutions at set points in the story. Also, unlike other characters, Agumon has 3 entirely different evolution lines, with each new form you unlock being decided by what your highest total karma stat is at that time. And honestly, it's a super cool idea that I kinda wish applied to all the other characters as well, but for story reasons, I also understand why it doesn't. As a quick side note here, I love how Survive treats these moments. I always enjoyed in the anime how unlocking these forms represented the character's growth and the strengthening bond they have with their partner, and the game perfectly captures that with both the story and how much of a spectacle they make of it with the cinematic that plays out each time a partner gets a new form. And on that note, before we move on to Survive's combat, we real quick gotta talk about its presentation, because this is easily the most beautiful visual novel I have ever seen. The artwork for all of the characters and the backgrounds is just gorgeous, and the usage of live 2D for everyone was a very smart choice, since it helps breathe some extra life into the characters during cutscenes. And even if you don't play this game yourself, you need to listen to its main theme. That song is heavenly. Massive props to the people in the dev team who worked on Digimon Survive's visuals and soundtrack. They did incredible work. Now, as for the strategy RPG part of Digimon Survive though, while the story is definitely great and worth playing for, the combat and strategy is unfortunately where we get to its biggest issue, because this is by far the weakest part of the game. During set points in the story, or in optional encounters, you'll be taken to a battle map where you'll choose a varying number of Digimon to put on the field. Instead of something like a player and enemy phase, Digimon Survive has a turn order determined by each unit's speed stat, with each one also having separate but set movement stats for horizontal and vertical movement that differ from unit to unit. Each Digimon also has a passive ability and 2 separate skills for combat, with one being a basic attack that costs 0 SP and one being a special move that costs a varying amount of it. I will say though, units having only 2 attacks could easily make things kinda dull for some people, since you're constantly using the same attack or 2 over and over again. And while you can alleviate this a bit by giving them an equip skill or 2, it more than likely won't really fix the problem for you. Partner Digimon technically have more than 2 though, since each evolution has its own attacks, but honestly there's no real incentive to use any form that isn't your strongest from my experience. And on that note, once per turn, each Digimon can change into one of their unlocked evolutions by spending a bit of SP, of which they'll also lose some SP every turn to maintain the form they're in, with said amount changing based on the form's rank. If you need to give a partner Digimon a boost mid-combat though, you can have that unit's human talk to either their Digimon or another for some kind of effect once per fight, such as a stat boost like with Minoru, who can boost a unit's movement, or healing with Aoi. You can also use the talk action to interact with enemy Digimon during optional encounters to either recruit them or ask for items if you can answer a set of 3 questions well enough, and let me tell ya, Shin Megami Tensei this is not. Honestly, while it's possible I'm just bad at this, I can't find any kind of consistent logic in what to say to these guys. Combine that with how weird some of the responses are, and this entire mechanic becomes a game of trial and error. At the very least though, the upside is that you don't need to bother with this too much if you don't want to. While the core 8 partners are almost always more than enough though, I would still recommend nabbing at least a few wild Digimon, because there will be some points where you'll have to use at least 1 or 2 for a fight. It's also possible to trigger something called an assist for healing or a higher hit rate, or even a team attack to rack up more damage, but both of those are based on random chance determined by that specific character and how high their affinity is. There are other things to keep in mind, like how attacks from the side and the back do more damage, and how being at a higher elevation when attacking raises your crit rate, but beyond that, there isn't too much to go over mechanically. This simplicity you're probably noticing by now extends to the battle maps as well. There's not too many of them, and they're all pretty bland in terms of design, with the only thing of note usually being the occasional gap only flying units can cross. Frankly, they'd benefit greatly from some extra terrain hazards. Plenty of people have criticized Digimon Survive's strategy gameplay for being overly simplistic as well as repetitive, and those people really aren't wrong. Said simplicity doesn't bother me personally, and the repetitiveness of the gameplay is something that I do personally enjoy because frankly I'm just weird like that, but I'm not blind to why others don't enjoy it at all. If you're somebody who's here for the story primarily, you more than likely won't be bothered by this, but if the combat is super important to you, then this simplicity will make Digimon Survive's combat kind of a drag. Credit where it's due though, this game does more than successfully satisfy my love for collecting things with all of the stuff you can find outside of battle. See, for some reason, the Digimon's world causes glitches for phone cameras when it's looking at hidden objects or Digimon traces. Using this, you'll be able to pull out your phone camera in a room and you can find items or even optional encounters with it. And because this game doesn't have a shop at all, this will be the only way you can get any kind of items at all outside of drops from battle. And let me tell you, the game knows this too, because it'll throw tons of items your way if you look hard enough, which, fittingly enough for this franchise, includes copious amounts of meat for healing SP, that you can even find in the most sanitary place of all, the sewer, because of course you do. As a quick note though, there are a series of 15 missable story collectibles you can also find with the camera. Each one is a chapter for one of 3 different stories that add some extra history and world building for the game, and collecting all 5 chapters of one will net you a special equip skill you can use. Word of warning though for completionists out there, you can only find the last 2 chapters for certain stories during specific routes, so getting all of them will require separate playthroughs. Really though, I think there's a great foundation for a great strategy RPG here. The game just needs like even 2 or 3 extra layers of complexity to its game design. At its core, this game is a more story-driven adventure than a gameplay one, so we don't really need anything super deep. But for Survive's hopefully inevitable sequel, stronger strategy RPG elements would go a long way in letting more people be able to enjoy it. And if that game's story is anything like this one in terms of quality, those people would be in for a great time. This is my way of saying that we've officially hit the spoiler section part of the video, because there's a few things about the game's story I can't not talk about. So skip to the timestamp here to avoid spoilers if you care about that at all. And with that warning out of the way, it's time to get back to these two. Ryo and Shuji are a very interesting set of characters. Ryo is someone I wouldn't blame you for disliking on the first playthrough, but that's where the true route comes in. Ryo's rudeness towards people and rampant pessimism is because he's a scared and depressed 15-year-old still coping with his mom's death that ultimately struggles with expressing himself. This is the exact reason that Kunimon can't properly speak. He's a representation for Ryo's inner struggles, and as he starts getting better and opens up to people, he starts learning how to understand Kunimon, which I interpret as him being able to fully understand himself, with all of this culminating in both Kunimon's ultimate and mega forms where he can finally talk normally. If you don't mind me getting personal for a moment here, as somebody with both chronic depression and autism, I completely get Ryo's struggle. It's so easy to completely lose hope in a bad situation when you're depressed, especially when you also have trouble telling people how you feel and that you need help at all. Him acting the way he does and having a mental breakdown during Chapter 3, all things considered, makes a lot of sense to me, and honestly, seeing Ryo become the stronger person he is by the end of the true route never fails at making me smile. And then we have Shuji. Oh boy. So, positives out of the way first here. I do think he's a well-written character. Shuji and Lotmon's relationship, while toxic and abusive outside of the true routes post-Chapter 5, is interesting because of how Lotmon reflects Shuji as a person in that he is Shuji. Specifically, Lotmon is who Shuji is deep down, that, courtesy of his abusive father, he believes to be all of his flaws and worst attributes. His treatment of Lotmon isn't just a clear case of how generational trauma continues the cycle of abuse. It's also a sort of metaphor for self-harm and the dangers for letting issues like these consume you. This scene with Wendigomon is also a perfect way to introduce Dark Digivolution to any newcomers playing this game, as well as all of the layers behind the bond between a Digimon and their human. The bond with a human can help a Digimon gain more power faster than if they were on their own, but that bond does not have to be a healthy one to accomplish that, and Lotmon was the perfect Digimon for showing this off, thanks to the dichotomy between the terrifying Wendigomon and the more adorable Teruimon. Putting all of that aside though, while there's a lot of genuinely well-written and interesting things about Shuji, he's unfortunately kinda poorly handled. A lot of people point out the fact that nobody does enough to stop Shuji's abuse fast enough, and while I would normally agree, I also understand that seniority respect is a big thing in Japan. But I'm not exactly an expert on this sort of thing, so I don't feel too comfortable one way or the other saying if this is an actual problem with the writing or not. My personal issue is that I feel like we don't explore his actual abuse or redemption enough. We only get one dream showing off his father's abuse, which was at the beginning of the chapter where Shuji goes off the deep end. By the time he starts actually losing it, we've seen and heard so little that I think it becomes too easy to just hate and discard any and all nuances of his character, because may I remind you, he's verbally and physically abusing one of the cutest creatures I've seen in fiction next to Terriermon. I also think his redemption is too short. I understand why Lotmon is so quick to forgive him, since remember, Lotmon is who Shuji truly is deep down, but I think the sudden, drastic changes in his ways is a bit too fast for me, and I wish the true route focused on that more. On the note of the true route though, while I like its story and the idea of a true ending, I'm gonna be honest, I have kinda conflicting feelings on it. It guarantees that you'll fully experience the game's darker tone and story moments, which could potentially make the true route's happier tone more rewarding, and it even encourages replayability. But at the same time, because the story doesn't drastically change too much until Chapter 9, barring the scenes with Ryo and Shuji in Chapters 3 and 5, most of a true route playthrough mostly consists of me fast-forwarding dialogue and steamrolling fights for 6 or 7 hours. Like, I love this game, but that's kinda boring. I also don't think the moment in Chapter 6 where the group distrusts their Digimon works here. In a normal playthrough it works because the character saw Lotmon turn into a creature literally called Wendigo-mon and watched as he devoured his partner. At the time, they had no concept for what Dark Digivolution was, so for all they knew, this was the natural next step for Lotmon, and their partners could follow suit. And with that not happening in the true route, the characters just feel overly paranoid. I suppose what I'd like to see in a Digimon Survive 2, something that the true route thankfully sets up, is a true route with more differences and changes compared to that game's normal routes, because that alone would pretty much fix all of my problems with this. I do have one more criticism for the story though before we end spoilers, and while it's a little thing, it is still important. They misgendered the puppy 6+ times in the span of 10 to 15 minutes. Come on translators, once or twice might be a typo, but this is just unprofessional. Nah, but for real though, the fact that this happens so much during this section is kinda ridiculous, and it does make me wonder if there were any other typos I might have missed somewhere. Like, I get that this game has a lot of text, so one or two things might slip through the cracks, but I would expect a little more proofreading than this. Digimon Survive as a game, even if I do enjoy it, has plenty of flaws. The combat, while a good foundation for a strategy RPG, is definitely too simplistic for its own good, and the map design really needs some work. As a visual novel though, the story and characters are the biggest reason for why I believe this game is as great as it is, and not just because these things are well written. These two parts of Survive combined with its visual novel gameplay elements make the whole experience feel like a really good and interactive season of the anime, one of Digimon's best aspects, and the very thing that I'm confident got most people into this franchise in the first place. Frankly, out of every game in the franchise I've played so far, Digimon Survive has easily given me one of the best experiences I've had. I know the series producer and functionally this game's creator, Kazumasa Habu, is, for currently unknown reasons, no longer going to be spearheading the production for games in this franchise going forward. But I still hope that someday we'll get a sequel for this game because, while I might just be biased here, I feel so strongly that if they can improve on the game's weaker aspects while having just as strong of a story, we could have an easy 10 out of 10 on our hands. Now that being said, hopefully the new Digimon story game will get an actual trailer soon. I've been wanting to talk about the Cyber Sleuth games for a while now, but I've been waiting on the new story game to get a release date first. Honestly, I'm about ready to just say screw it and make those videos regardless. I've been waiting years to make them. But I digress. Thank you all for watching, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I hope you all have a nice day.